I am 66 years old, and I have carried this secret longer than I carried my marriage, my ranch, or my youth. I have told doctors about my lungs, priests about my sins, bankers about my debts, but never this. The canyon behind my barn has kept it for me, holding breath and memory the way stone holds cold. In the autumn of 1989, when frost first silvered the grass, I was already tired in my bones. That was when my horse began refusing to leave a place I had never named. Until I believed nothing waited. She was a sorrel mare, 14 years old, scarred at the knees, gentle with children and stubborn with men. Clara had carried my wife the summer before she died, and after that she carried me through days that felt hollowed out. Horses know grief. They smell it, feel it in the reins. That fall, Clara started drifting away from the barn at dawn, slow and deliberate, not spooked. She crossed the creek, climbed the shale rise, and stopped in the same clearing every time, ears forward, breathing steady, waiting. I never questioned her, not once, at first back then alone. At first I blamed coyotes, then weather, then age, because explanations are easier than wonder. But nothing was taken from her, no sweat lathered her flanks, no fear lived in her eyes. The clearing smelled different, damp and loamy, like turned soil and old rain, and the forest fell quiet around it. No birds argued overhead. No insects sang. I felt it in my chest, a pressure like altitude, as if the land itself was holding something back from me, something patient. I pretended not to notice, which is how fear first survives inside men like me for years quietly. The fourth morning I followed her, boots wet, breath white, heart louder than the creek. I kept my hand near the rifle out of habit, not courage. In the clearing I found a neat pile of chokecherries and split roots laid on a flat stone. Nothing chewed, nothing scattered. It felt intentional, careful. Clara lowered her head and ate calmly, as if invited. I stood there smelling moss and something else, musky and warm, and I understood then that whatever shared this place knew us already. My skin prickled with warning and awe together like standing before a storm breaking. I did not tell anyone, because speaking would have made it real, and real things can be taken. Days passed. Weeks followed. Clara returned to that clearing every morning, and every evening she came back fed, calm, unmarked. I began leaving apples at the tree line, telling myself it was for deer. They vanished by dawn. In their place appeared smooth stones stacked 3 high. I slept lighter then, listening to the woods breathe, knowing I was no longer alone, yet unsure what that truly meant. Silence became my accomplice, heavy and protective but also dangerously fragile as secrets are. Late October brought fog that clung to the canyon walls like damp wool. One morning I saw him, though I did not understand that word yet. A shape moved beyond the spruce, tall, slow, deliberate, carrying weight with care. Gray hair caught the light, not fur exactly, more like weathered fiber. He placed food on the stone and stepped back. I tasted iron in my mouth. Clara did not flinch. She breathed, steady as prayer. And in that moment fear bent, quietly, into something closer to trust. My hands shook despite the cold because understanding carries weight of its own. I did not follow him. I did not raise the rifle. I stood and let the clearing teach me restraint. Over the following days, signs accumulated like quiet testimony. Footprints pressed deep into mud, wider than my chest. Branches bent without breaking. Once, near the barn, I found a bundle of sage tied with twine I recognized from my shed. He knew my tools. He knew my habits. The canyon was no longer empty space. It was shared ground, and sharing, I learned, requires more courage than confrontation. Especially when fear watches silently from the edges of belief and doubt. Winter approached early that year, bringing cold nights and rumors from town. A hunter spoke of screams echoing through the ridge. Another mentioned tracks near the river. I said nothing, though my chest tightened each time. Clara grew more protective of the clearing, ears flicking, body angled toward the trees. I sensed watchfulness, not threat. Still, sleep came thin, broken by dreams of lights cutting through fog, of men with questions and guns. I understood then that discovery would mean harm, and harm would demand a choice I was not ready to make. Love had already complicated things quietly, deeply. As November darkened, I noticed him watching from farther back, keeping distance as if respecting my fear. I brought blankets to the edge of the clearing, pretending they were forgotten. They vanished. In their place lay a carved piece of wood, smoothed by patient hands into the shape of a horse's head. I sat on the barn step and cried then, not from terror, but recognition. Something ancient had chosen kindness. Something wounded understood care. And I realized this secret was no accident. It was a responsibility, heavy and irrevocable. One I could not abandon without losing what remained inside. I wish I could say the story stayed gentle, but truth rarely does. The bond between Clara and the unseen guardian deepened, quiet and deliberate, and so did the danger circling us. Tracks appeared closer to the house. The air felt watched. On the last morning of this season, as frost hardened the ground, Clara refused to return at dusk. The clearing swallowed her shape and kept it. I stood alone with night coming fast, understanding too late that trust invites consequence, and love, once given, demands everything. I stepped forward, knowing I could not turn back any more that night. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was only a dull glow behind the trees, bleeding amber through the branches like an ember in a dying hearth. My breath came out hard, white, rattling from the climb. Clara stood in the center of that hollow patch of earth again, just as she had every day for weeks now. Her head was low, chewing something. I stepped carefully into the space, heart loud in my ears. The silence was thick. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dead needles under my boots and the aching pull of knowing I wasn't alone. I didn't know it then, but that night would begin a bond one couldn't explain, and couldn't undo. There was food again on the stone, wild carrots, smooth river apples, mushrooms that hadn't grown anywhere near my land in decades. But more than that, there were footprints. Huge, arched, human-shaped, but far too wide and too deep. They circled the spot slowly, cautiously, and stopped where Clara stood. And she didn't flinch. That shook me worse than anything. She just kept chewing like this thing, whatever it was, had earned her trust long before I ever showed up to witness it. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I just watched, feeling more like an intruder than a rancher. Later that night, back at the barn, I couldn't sleep. The wind scraped the roof, dry and howling like some old warning. I thought of my late wife, her voice soft and practical, always telling me animals knew things we never would. "They're closer to the old truths," she'd say. "They still listen." I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. But I felt it, the weight of something ancient pressing just beneath the fabric of my ordinary life, and it was asking to be seen. Over the next week, the pattern held. Clara would walk to that same clearing without fail. And more than once, I stayed in the shadows to see who else might come. I never got a clear view. Not at first. Just movement. A shape, too tall and too wide for any man I'd known, moving with deliberate care along the tree-line. It didn't storm through the woods. It stepped gently. It watched. I started bringing gifts of my own, oats, dried apples, even an old flannel shirt when the nights dropped into frost. I'd leave them at the edge, and each morning they'd be gone. In their place were things I never imagined. Sticks bundled with river reeds, feathers woven with what looked like strands of horsehair, polished stones too smooth to be shaped by accident. He was watching us the whole time. I say he now because something in the way he moved told me that. Not aggression. Not dominance. Just presence. Thoughtfulness. Maybe age. It felt masculine the way thunder does. Strong, far off, but never careless. One morning, I caught a longer look. Mist was still lifting off the ground, and the light came slantwise through the evergreens like theater curtains parting. He stepped forward enough for me to see his face, and my knees nearly gave out. There was intelligence there, sorrow even, carved into a brow heavy with time. His eyes were deep-set, reflecting the sky like still water. He blinked slowly, and I swear to God, it felt like greeting. Clara stepped forward before I did. She nudged the apple closer to his feet, then walked back toward me without fear. That moment rewired something in me. Trust, I suppose, passed between two creatures who had no need for words. And I was no longer afraid. Not of him. not of what this meant. But I knew, with the quiet certainty you get when snow starts to fall, that we were crossing a line. I didn't know if we could ever step back from it. I started spending longer hours at the clearing. Sometimes I brought coffee, sat on a stump, watched the fog lift. I began to understand the way the trees bent ever so slightly, forming a cradle around that glade. I heard sounds that didn't belong to any known animal. Low hums. Soft whistles. At night, I would dream of him moving through the woods, not like a beast, but like an old sentinel watching over a place no map ever named. I found myself speaking aloud when I thought I was alone, telling the clearing about my wife, about Clara's birth, about the flood in '74 that nearly ended everything. And sometimes, I felt he was listening. Then came the gift I couldn't explain away. A carving, rough but precise, left on the edge of my porch. It was shaped like a horse, its legs bent in motion, its mane catching the wind. Whoever made it had watched Clara, watched her move. The angles were too specific to be guesswork. I ran my hand over the grooves and felt tears I didn't know I had waiting at the edges of my eyes. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was care, recognition, and with that came something heavier, responsibility. Of course, not everything stayed quiet. One morning I noticed a truck parked near the old trailhead. Out-of-state plates. Binoculars on the dash. I didn't approach, but I watched from a distance as a man stepped out, scanned the woods, and scribbled something into a weather-beaten notebook. He didn't look like a hiker. He looked like someone sent to confirm rumors. That night, I moved the offerings deeper into the clearing and watched the darkness swallow them whole. Clara grew more alert. She'd start whinnying at dusk, pacing near the barn, eyes fixed toward the ridge. I took to sleeping with the window open, shotgun close, not to use it, but to understand what I might have to choose between. I didn't want violence, but I'd come to realize how easily a good thing could be ruined by a man with the wrong kind of interest. And secrets, once spotted, rarely stay safe. Then, just before the first snowfall, Clara returned with something tangled in her mane, a loop of woven grass, like a bracelet. It was knotted at the ends. Not randomly. Deliberately. My hands shook as I untangled it, realizing it matched the pattern from the earlier carvings. He had touched her. Not in fear. Not in harm. But in affection. Maybe even farewell. I stood that evening in the clearing longer than I ever had. The cold bit through my coat, but I didn't move. The sky above shifted to indigo, the last light dying on the treetops. And from the woods behind me came a single sound, low, mournful, like wind blowing through an empty pipe. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a man. But it was close. Closer than ever. And when I turned, there were two sets of footprints in the frost. One large. One smaller. Both walking away from me, side by side. The snow came earlier than usual that year, soft and dry like sifted flour, covering the ridge in silence. It dulled the sound of everything. Hoofbeats, breath, even my thoughts. Clara moved slower now, careful on the frozen ground, her joints stiff in the mornings. I wrapped her legs with old wool and spoke gently as I worked. She was aging, and I could feel it in the way she leaned into my hands, like someone who'd been strong too long and finally let herself be helped. The forest, too, seemed slower, more watchful. The clearing had changed. The air held a tension I couldn't name. I didn't see him for days. Not fully. Just glimpses, dark movement behind branches, the hush of snow falling from pine boughs too thick to drop by wind alone. But the offerings continued. One morning I found a pile of dry kindling arranged near the edge of the clearing, fanned out like a sunburst, and beside it, a small piece of fur, gray and matted, curled at the edge, stained dark. Blood, maybe. The next morning, the tracks he left were deeper, dragged in places. Limping. Something was wrong. I crushed aspirin into mashed apples and left them near the flat stone, hoping he'd know. I thought of how many wild things die slowly, without witness, and the idea made my chest feel hollow. The forest felt heavier that day, like the trees themselves were listening. When I returned that evening, the food was gone, and in its place lay a single long feather, dusted with frost, curved gently as if laid there with reverence. It wasn't a trade. It was a thank you. One night the wind howled hard against the windows, and I heard Clara cry out, sharp, high, frightened. I ran barefoot to the barn, rifle forgotten, lantern barely lit. She was untouched, but the gate was wide open, swinging. Snow was churned around her hooves. Large prints, again, barefoot, even in that cold. They circled her, then led away. Not running. Walking slowly, toward the forest. He'd come to check on her. In the middle of a snowstorm. He wasn't afraid of cold or darkness. But something else was chasing him. I felt it then. Something had shifted out there, something that didn't belong. The next morning, I drove into town for supplies, and that's when I saw the black SUV parked near the edge of Main Street. Dark windows. Government plates. Two men stood by the diner, one with a clipboard, the other scanning the tree line like he'd already made up his mind. I walked past with my coat pulled tight and my eyes on the sidewalk. As I passed, one of them asked if I'd heard any strange animal calls near the ridge lately. I said I'd heard owls. Lots of 'em. He nodded, smiling with the corners of his mouth but not his eyes. They weren't here for owls. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the woods from my porch, shotgun laid across my knees, though I knew it wouldn't do a damn bit of good. If they were tracking him, I didn't know how much time I had before someone followed the same trail Clara had been walking for weeks. I considered burning the clearing, cutting the trees, erasing the path. But that felt like betrayal, like turning my back on someone who had never once turned his back on us. And besides, Clara would just find her way there again. The next time I saw him, it was different. He came closer. I was sitting on the ground beside the offering stone, my coat zipped, knees aching from the cold. I had brought warm bread, soaked in honey, and laid it beside a folded flannel blanket. He stepped into the clearing like the wind pushed him forward, as if he'd run out of places to hide. He looked smaller somehow, less upright, one arm wrapped tight against his side. I could hear his breath from 10 feet away, ragged and wet. His fur was tangled with snow. His eyes, those ancient glassy eyes, locked with mine, and I nodded, slow, deliberate, like a promise. He sat, if you could call it that, knees bending awkwardly as he lowered himself beside the stone. He didn't eat. He just rested. Clara approached from behind me, slowly, and stood beside him, muzzle near his shoulder. He didn't move. Just turned slightly, as if to acknowledge her presence. I watched the two of them together, beast and beast, or maybe neither, and I felt a knot in my chest I hadn't known was their start to loosen. I whispered, "You're safe here," and I wasn't sure if I was saying it to him or to myself. The next day, there were helicopters. Low-flying, gray, ugly things with purpose in their shadows. I stayed in the barn, holding Clara's reins, my heart racing with each pass overhead. They didn't land. Not yet. But the snow told stories, tracks of heavy boots on the far ridge, cigarette butts near the trailhead, a mark on one of my trees, painted red. They were getting closer. I moved quickly. I gathered every carving, every feather, every woven token and buried them deep behind the barn, under the old maple where my dog had been laid to rest 20 years ago. I left nothing behind. I brushed over the clearing with pine branches, disturbed every pattern in the snow, and led Clara the long way around, away from the ridge. But the air still felt marked. I had the sense of being watched, but not by him this time. By something colder, less curious. The kind of eyes that looked through you and saw only data. I didn't see him again for 6 days. Each morning I checked the clearing, and it was untouched. No food. No tracks. No sound. Even Clara seemed restless, shifting her weight, ears flicking toward the trees. Then, on the 7th morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. At the center of the clearing lay a torn piece of government-issued nylon. A strap from a pack. And beside it, half buried in the snow, were claw marks deep in the bark of the offering tree, as if something had fought, or warned, or bled. And just beneath that, pressed into the snow, was a single bloody handprint. Not theirs. His. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the ridge like a living thing, swallowing the sky before noon. Snow fell thick and fast, the kind that erased tracks and sound alike, leaving the world blind and quiet. Clara grew agitated, stamping in the barn, her breath steaming hard. When she broke the halter and pushed past me into the white, I knew where she was going. My joints screamed as I followed, lungs burning, each step an argument with age and fear. I did not bring the rifle. I brought only myself, because some moments demand honesty more than defense, and I had already chosen who I was loyal to. The canyon was nearly unrecognizable, the clearing buried beneath drifts that reached my thighs. Wind scoured my face raw, stealing heat and thought alike. Then I saw them. Clara stood at the center, sides heaving, and beside her he knelt, massive and hunched, his broad back curved against the gale. One arm hung useless, dark with frozen blood, torn where something sharp had bitten deep. He had wrapped himself around her, shielding her body with his own, taking the storm full on his shoulders. The sight broke something open inside me. He had stayed. Even hunted, wounded, and dying, he had stayed. I stumbled forward and fell to my knees in the snow. The cold cut through my clothes, numbing pain into distant fire. He turned his head slowly. His eyes found mine through the storm, and there was no fear in them now, only exhaustion and something like relief. I reached out, touching his fur, warm beneath the ice, coarser than any hide I had ever handled. He flinched once, then leaned into the contact, breathing hard, each breath a labor. I pressed my forehead to his shoulder and cried without sound, because words felt too small for the truth between us. Up close, I could see the damage. The wound was deep, ragged, the kind left by steel or teeth meant to kill. I tore my shirt, wrapped it tight, and he let me, trusting hands that trembled with age. I spoke to him then, low and steady, telling him he mattered, that he had done enough, that Clara would live. He watched my mouth move, listening in his own way. When I finished, he lifted his good hand and pressed it briefly against my chest, right where my heart struggled. It was not strength he offered. It was recognition. The wind howled harder, and my legs finally gave out. I don't remember collapsing, only waking to the smell of smoke and hay. The barn glowed with firelight, shadows dancing along the walls. Clara lay beside me, alive, pressed close, her heart steady against my ribs. Thick hides covered my body. My hands were wrapped, clumsily but carefully, the knots unfamiliar but thoughtful. Outside, the storm had passed. The world looked scrubbed clean, innocent again. He was gone. No tracks. No sign. Just absence so complete it ached. I understood then that survival sometimes requires disappearance, and love does not always stay. 4 days afterward, I searched, though I knew better. The forest gave me nothing. No prints. No sound. Only quiet acceptance. Clara never returned to the clearing after that winter. She weakened quickly, her spirit still bright but her body spent. On a clear morning in early spring, she lay down beneath the maple and did not rise again. I buried her myself, the ground soft with thaw, the air smelling of damp earth and beginnings. I placed the wooden carving with her, pressing it into the soil like a final promise kept. The forest watched, silent and respectful. The men never came back. The helicopters faded from the sky. Whatever records existed were closed or forgotten. Seasons turned, and years stacked quietly on my shoulders. I grew older. My hands stiffened. My breath shortened. Some nights I woke gasping, convinced I was still buried in snow, still hearing the wind tear at the canyon walls. Each time, I reminded myself I had been spared, not by luck, but by choice made in compassion. I learned to live with the weight of that choice. I sold parts of the ranch, kept only what I could tend. I spoke less, listened more. Loneliness settled in, but it no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by memory. The canyon aged with me, and I aged with it, both of us holding something we would never surrender to noise or disbelief. Sometimes I would sit at the barn door and speak into the dark, thanking him for Clara, for the fire, for my life. I never expected an answer. Gratitude does not require response. It only requires memory, and I carried him in mine as carefully as any man carries a prayer. Time has a way of thinning the veil between past and present, especially when the body grows weak and the nights grow long and quiet and reflective with age and long-held memories stirring softly. Now, as I sit here with my hands trembling and my breath short, I tell this story not for belief, but for gratitude. He taught me that kindness does not require language, that loyalty can cross any boundary, and that sacrifice is often quiet and unseen. I learned that fear can be unlearned, and that protection is sometimes the bravest form of love. When my time comes, I hope the land remembers me the way I remember him. Not as a witness, but as someone who chose to protect what could not protect itself. The clearing still exists, though few would notice it now. Moss has reclaimed the stone. The trees lean inward, older, heavier, patient. But sometimes at dusk, when the light fades gold and the wind hushes the birds, I feel a presence standing just beyond sight. And I smile, knowing some bonds do not end. They simply step back into the woods, carrying our love with them forever. At last. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.